All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second in our masterclass series. We are so happy to have everybody joining us today. As many of you likely know, today is part of our series of masterclasses featuring our faculty experts, and it's part of our celebration of Rockefeller College's 75th anniversary. So this is a very special series of events for us and giving us a chance to really highlight the research and expertise of our faculty members. So today's discussion is led by Associate Professor of Political Science, Brian Greenhill, and he's going to be covering the topic of international cooperation on climate change. As he's giving his presentation, I invite all of you to use the chat function. Feel free to start posting your questions that you may have for him. And at the conclusion of his presentation, he'll take some time and answer any questions or as many as he can, given our time. We have 1 hour for this, so I'm sure we have a lot to cover. One note is that closed captioning has been enabled. If you're in need of that, you can find it either in the chat function to find the live transcript, or at the bottom of your screen. It depends on which version of Zoom you are using. Additionally, I want to let everyone know, and you probably all saw this pop up on your screen, today's session is being recorded and it will be shared at a later date on our YouTube channel. I believe that's it for me, and Professor Greenhill, I will turn it right over to you.
Great. Well, thanks very much for the introduction, Kelly, and thanks to all of you out there who are joining us at lunchtime today for this Lunch and Learn series. So today I'm going to be talking about international cooperation on climate change. So my own research is on the role that international institutions play in international relations. And I focus particularly on climate change and human rights issues. But what I was thinking I would do today is the following. Is first of all, I'll spend just a few minutes going over just some of the kind of basic points about climate change that are obviously going to kind of affect how we think about this as a problem that needs to be regulated in the international space. And then we're going to talk about why this is such a difficult problem from a political scientist's point of view, in terms of why it's so hard to try to get countries to cooperate in dealing with this problem. And then we'll turn to a kind of quick review of what we've tried so far, specifically the 1997 Kyoto Protocol and the 2015 Paris Agreement, which is now kind of the international kind of architecture that we have in place to try to deal with this problem. And then we'll turn to some discussion on, what we think the prospects are, what's likely to work, what's perhaps less likely to work, and so on. Okay, so let me start with just a sort of brief climate change 101. I'll just spend a couple minutes doing this, but the problem with climate change is that our modern society depends upon, or has come to depend upon, the burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gasoline. That's where most of our energy has traditionally come from. But burning all of these fuels release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And it's now been well established that as carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere, it acts like a kind of blanket, like a warm blanket around the planet. So it's causing global temperatures to rise. And one other kind of side effect of having that extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is that it's dissolving into the water in the oceans and making oceans more acidic, which is then having implications for fish and coral reefs and so on. What's also kind of really important here, and that I think is one of the kind of big problems that we face in trying to kind of convey the seriousness of the problem to kind of wider audiences, is that even just small changes in average temperatures can have very significant changes to the Earth's climate. And I'll talk a little bit more in the next slide about kind of why that is. But this last point here really, I feel, is impossible to kind of overemphasize. We are now in a situation here in 2022 where the scientific consensus on the kind of human contribution to climate change is overwhelming, right? We're now in a position, unlike maybe in the, 1980s and early 1990s, where really there are no serious scientists who have any doubt about the role that fossil fuels play in driving this process. So part of, and one of the things we'll talk about is one of the strategies used by people who, you know, have a political interest in not taking action in climate change is to try to muddy the waters, to try to suggest that maybe there's still some degree of scientific uncertainty, but basically there's not. You know, that the kind of alternative explanations have been pretty firmly kind of put to rest, particularly in the last 20 years or so. Okay, so one of the things that I always like to tell my students or ask them to think about is, you know, given that climate change, you know, most of the discussion is about, can we keep global warming within this target of either 1.5 degrees average warming or, you know, 2 degrees average warming and so on. And people often think, you know, well, that doesn't sound like much, you know, given what we know of just our experience of kind of weather related changes from one day to the next. We're used to like huge fluctuations in temperature. So why should we worry about a relatively modest warming of like a couple of degrees? And the answer basically is that the climate, as well as all the ecosystems that support our lifestyle on Earth, can be thought of as a highly complex system where there are lots of intricate kind of interdependencies between different parts of it. And what this all means is that sometimes if you make like one small change to one variable, say like over here, it could end up having like really significant effects on some other variable somewhere else. And obviously there's like a whole big science around this, but just to give you kind of a flavor of some of the things to think about that help us kind of, as you know, non-atmospheric scientists, get a better appreciation of how these things work. Because one of them is the idea of what we call positive feedback loops. You know, the idea that sometimes you can have a small change in a complex system, which ends up affecting some other downstream components, which then somehow amplify its effect. And when we think about the climate of planet Earth, there were lots of these potential positive feedback loops. So to give like a simple example, we can talk about the difference between ice and water in terms of its ability to reflect light. Okay, so at the moment, you know, the Earth is in a state where we've got these big ice caps at the North and South Pole, and because they're white, they reflect back a lot of light from the sun. As they start to melt, though, you're going to see a lot of this snow-covered ice cap be turned into the oceans, into just water, which is darker, you know, it's a kind of blue, gray, green color. And so that's then going to absorb more light from the sun. So that's then going to accelerate warming. So as the ice caps start to melt, we're going to see not only, you know, the loss of the ice caps, but also an acceleration of the rate at which further global warming is taking place. So another example of like a positive feedback loop kind of in this vein is, some of you may be familiar with the idea of the permafrost in the in the very kind of northern latitudes, like around the Arctic, where in this frozen terrain, like in the very north of like Canada and Russia and so on, there's a lot of methane trapped under there. And so as that ground begins to melt, methane gas that had been trapped under there for thousands of years is going to be released into the atmosphere. Unfortunately, methane gas is a very, very potent greenhouse gas. So that's going to be have a far stronger effect than carbon dioxide does in terms of its ability to trap heat in the Earth's atmosphere. So what many climate scientists worry about is, as we see more thawing of the permafrost in the northern latitudes, we'll start to see an even greater acceleration of climate change because of the more heat trapping gases being released into the atmosphere. So it's these kinds of positive feedback loops that can cause even a relatively modest change in temperature that wouldn't have much of an effect on our lives or on, you know, many animal and plants' lives, to end up having a kind of really potentially catastrophic impact on other systems around the world. Another way when we think of the climate, through the lens of like a complex system, is that in addition to these positive feedback loops, there's also the tendency for tipping points, as we call them, to exist. And the analogy I use when talking to my students is think of like a game of Jenga. So you can play that game for a while, removing individual blocks, and not much happens. Maybe the tower wobbles a little bit, maybe it begins to shift a bit to one side, but eventually you'll pull away a block that will cause a kind of catastrophic change. The whole tower will start to fall down. And so the worry on the part of climate scientists is that these changes may be non-linear, or most certainly non-linear, in the sense that maybe you think, well, we can tolerate a certain greater frequency of hurricanes and so on. Maybe we can kind of adapt to that. But if we keep kind of pushing the boundary, we might get to a point where we reach some kind of tipping point that leads to really catastrophic change. So because of this very kind of well-grounded fear of reaching certain tipping points at different parts of the Earth's climate systems, there is kind of very, very strong consensus now that we need to keep this average temperature change of the world as a whole well below 2 degrees centigrade. It's not as if 2 degrees itself has any special significance. It's just that somewhere around there, we know if we go much past that, we're going to be much more likely to cross over some of these thresholds, which will then be much harder to kind of walk back from. So ideally, what we're hoping for is to try to keep our average rate of global warming to somewhere closer to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Right now, unfortunately, we're at 1.1 degrees. So we've got about 0.4 degrees centigrade of kind of room left for maneuver before things start to get pretty dicey. And just to give you an example of that, here's a story from a couple of weeks ago from the Washington Post about how climate scientists are showing that the Greenland ice sheet is now kind of reaching a point where it's, unfortunately kind of getting very close to one of these tipping points where it could, by the end of the century, lead to nearly a foot rise in sea levels in a way that wasn't, that's even worse than some of the more dire predictions from a few years ago. Okay, so in terms of, I won't belabor this point in terms of consequences of climate change, but as I'm sure most of us are familiar from the news, we certainly hear a lot about more extreme weather events. We're seeing a lot more droughts, wildfires, hurricanes, and so on with greater frequency than we used to see, and much of which can now be attributed to climate change in a way that was kind of harder to do a few years ago. We're also seeing, and are going to see, a rise in sea level, which is going to be very damaging for many large cities throughout the world that are at relatively low elevations, like New York City and Miami are like good examples of these. What's also concerning is the impact that climate change is likely to have on food production, right? And here, the story is kind of nuanced in the sense that there'll be certain parts of the world that will actually benefit from a warming climate. Some northern latitudes will find that, they will be, the agricultural lands will be more productive. But many others, of course, will suffer enormously. There'll be water shortages and so on. There'll be changes because of like the acidification of the oceans. There'll be changes to the availability of like, fisheries and so on. So there are obviously very kind of worrying consequences in terms of global food supply. Other things that are perhaps less obvious to, to people who have, just a sort of passing interest in climate change is some of the indirect effects that climate change might have on things like migration. For example, we're already seeing, and we almost certainly are likely to see, very large waves of what we call like climate refugees, where people have been displaced from their homes because of persistent droughts or rising sea levels and so on, and needing to, find safety elsewhere, which, not only is obviously, extremely bad for the people directly concerned, but then it will have interesting and potentially very worrying kind of political consequences if we see a lot of people moving from one area to another, and then, leading to resentment in these areas, which can then lead to political backlashes and so on. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on. Another too is health, right? The warming climate, although in itself doesn't have a very direct impact on human health, it can have various kind of indirect impacts through, for example, the more diseases or insect-borne diseases, like malaria and so on, spreading to areas where it wasn't previously prevalent. Here in the northeast of the US, Lyme disease is perhaps a good example of this, where climate change is playing at least some role in facilitating the greater spread of Lyme disease. And then, of course, there's conflict. Once you have resource scarcity, you're more likely to have conflict between different groups of people, both within individual countries and across national borders. And so for that reason, for many years now, like the US Department of Defense has been investing a lot of energy in studying the impact that climate change is having and is likely to have in the future on possible kind of political flashpoints between different countries. I would say, though, and I think it's really important to kind of appreciate the kind of complexity of this, these consequences will vary substantially from place to place. There will be some people living in some places that will benefit in certain ways as a result of climate change. Unfortunately, for the most part, though, the net effect is going to be very kind of damaging in terms of there'll be a lot more quote unquote, losers as a result of climate change than there will be winners, especially when we think about issues like food production and so on. Okay, so on that rather depressing note, having talked about, the danger, having talked about the many negative consequences of climate change, the question that we as political scientists or people who study kind of policy-making processes would want to know is, so how do we stop this thing from happening? Okay, and the good news when it comes to climate change policy is that the answer is actually quite obvious, right? We know that if we get people to produce less carbon dioxide, as well as other greenhouse gases like methane, then the extent of global warming can be minimized, right? So this isn't like a problem where, when you think of like the early days of the COVID pandemic, where policymakers were kind of trying to decide, like, is lockdown the best solution, or should we consider, one alternative versus another? Here, at least in the kind of big picture, is pretty obvious. We need to decarbonize our economies. We need to wean ourselves off fossil fuels and start employing more alternative forms of energy. The problem is, though, the problem for society and what for us as academics who study the political process is that this is kind of an enormously difficult political problem to try to deal with. To try to take this recommendation here that we get people to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide they're producing and actually turn that into workable policy is really hard. And so what I'd like to do now is spend a few minutes kind of trying to take apart what the different pieces of that puzzle are in terms of what is it that makes it so difficult to get countries to agree to lower their greenhouse gas emissions. And just to be clear about my terminology here, GHG stands for greenhouse gases. So the biggest culprit is carbon dioxide, but we've also got methane, which is released a lot into the atmosphere from many different sources, a lot of times just from leakage from pipes and so on, but also from like landfills and so on. Methane, as I said earlier, is a really potent greenhouse gas. We've also got nitrous oxide, and there are a few others, like some of the coolants used in like air conditioners and so on, that tend to be like very, very powerful greenhouse gases. So why is it so hard to get countries to agree to lower their greenhouse gas emissions? And there's several reasons I want to kind of look at. One of them is the communication problem, right? When you think of other global problems that we face, think of like terrorism, like in the wake of 9/11, for example, the horrible events of 9/11, where, even for people who had no direct connection to the events of that day, the images of it were kind of seared in people's minds and consciousness for many years to come. So there was no problem in the years after 9/11 getting the public and getting governments around the world to take the problem of international terrorism seriously. Unfortunately, when it comes to a problem like climate change, there isn't something that we can kind of see with our very own eyes that will get people to kind of realize the gravity of the problem they're dealing with. Climate change happens relatively slowly, at least on the timescale of our kind of human lives. So it's very hard to take it seriously. We've all got other things going on in our lives. People in other countries, you know, think of, like, for example, the population in Ukraine just now. Obviously, climate change is, would, you know, they'd be forgiven for not having climate change as their number one concern right now. So because of this, it's very hard for climate change to kind of break through in our political conversation, both here in the US and in the rest of the world, as something that we really need to take seriously. Another kind of factor that causes it to be difficult to get people to kind of act on the issue of climate change is just human nature. You know, the fact that we're dealing with events that, even though they're beginning to happen now, the real dangerous bad stuff is still, you know, quite far in the future. It's very hard to get people to kind of properly value threats that are, you know, many, many years out in the future. You know, just as it's difficult to get, you know, young adults in their 20s or 30s to like start thinking about retirement saving, it's difficult to get people to sort of start thinking about something that's like this, that's going to have a massive impact, but that's going to be on a time scale of decades rather than, you know, days or weeks. Okay. And the third one that we political scientists study a lot is the role of different interest groups. Okay, now because our fantastic economic success, like as a planet over the past 200 years or so, has been fueled by the burning of fossil fuels, the fossil fuel industry has obviously built up a very strong kind of political power base. And people who work for the fossil fuel industry, or people who at least lead the fossil fuel industry, have had a very strong incentive for many years to try to resist change, to try to at least, you know, cast out or muddy the waters on like the science of climate change, or at least to nowadays perhaps to take more nuanced approaches and to say that, well, you know, maybe the cure could be worse than the disease, and trying to kind of make arguments like that. So we have a very politically entrenched fossil fuel industry that has been very resistant to change. That's obviously going to impact their own economic interests. Okay, this fourth one is really the one that keeps those of us like me who study international relations kind of busiest, which is what we call a collective action problem, which happens whenever we have a situation where there's a kind of mismatch between who incurs the costs of taking certain action and who gets to enjoy the benefits. Right, so you can think of there are many problems that we deal with in our individual lives where there's a fairly close correspondence between who benefits from something and who pays the costs. So let's say if you're not feeling well and you decide, I'm going to go to the doctor, or I'm going to get my COVID booster to reduce the chances of getting sick this winter, you know, then you pay a small cost in terms of having to make a doctor's appointment to do that, but you get the benefits accruing to yourself. The problem with something like climate change is that because the carbon dioxide that goes out from our car tailpipes and up into the atmosphere gets mixed about with everything else in the atmosphere and is kind of shared by the whole planet, any actions that we take, like here in the US, for example, to reduce our carbon footprint will lead to benefits that get shared by the whole world. Okay, so many countries and many leaders of countries will make the argument, why should I bother trying to reduce my country's carbon dioxide emissions when other countries are just going to keep on going, building their coal-fired power plants and pumping out a whole ton more carbon dioxide? So why should we put ourselves at an economic disadvantage by trying to kind of change our whole economic model now when other countries are just going to kind of undo that benefit. And so what we have there is a classic collective action problem whereby people end up realizing that, yes, we ought to act on this thing, on this problem, but it's really hard to get people motivated to act because everyone worries that their efforts are just going to be kind of undone by the carelessness of other people. Okay, so that really, from a political science point of view, that is really the nub of this whole climate change problem. And what I'm going to talk about next are some of the ways in which countries have, or international institutions have tried to deal with that collective action problem. A couple other things I wanted to add to this list, like as if it's not hard enough based on what I've already told you, there's some other things that add even further complexity. One of them, and a really important one, is the kind of fairness issue, right? When we look at the world as a whole, you know, the world is careening towards this climate crisis, right? But it's not as if we have all contributed equally to that mess, okay? The rich countries of the world, like the US and most of the Western European countries, are really, and I'll show you some slides later, you know, they're really the ones that have kind of over the past 200 years produced most of the carbon dioxide that has led to the warming of the atmosphere. Other countries like China, for example, which is now the world's largest emitter of carbon dioxide, when, you know, it actually, in the sort of larger sweep of history, has made a relatively modest contribution to the problem. So the argument that many developing countries make in international climate negotiations is, you know, why should they be asked to kind of pay an equal price to the developed countries, given that it's these rich countries that have really been most responsible for the problem? So it's a little bit like, you know, a situation perhaps many of you can relate to as a parent, when you come in and you see your kids have made a mess of the living room and you say, you guys have to tidy this up, and you have one kid pointing blame at the other saying, no, well, the other one is responsible, not me, and so on, and then no one ends up dealing with it. So whatever kind of institutional solution we have at the international level needs to come up with some way of addressing the kind of fairness concern, making sure that there's some accommodation made for the fact that some countries have played a much larger role than others historically in contributing to the problem. Okay. And then finally, like as if that's not all bad enough, the problem we deal with trying to come up with solutions at an international level to problems like climate change is that in the international system is such that there's no real world government, right? International agreements between countries are really just dependent on the countries that sign them choosing to honor them. Okay, I mean, for example, we all know that like Russia, you know, flagrantly violated its obligations under the UN Charter when it invaded Ukraine, and, you know, not only this year, but also in 2014. But there's not much we can do about it because there's not like a kind of UN police that can come in and, you know, punish a country for violating its obligations under international law. So whatever agreement we try to construct at the international level has to be made against this background of knowing that it's going to kind of depend on voluntary enforcement on the part of the parties involved. Okay, so that this gives us a pretty hard, in fact, an incredibly difficult set of constraints to work with when it comes to trying to bring about international cooperation on climate change. And so what I'm going to talk about for the remainder of the kind of lecture component of this is what we've tried to do so far, at least at the international level. And there are three things I'm going to talk about just kind of in chronological order. There's the 1992 UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, known as the UNFCCC. There's the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, and the 2015 Paris Agreement, which is the regime we have in place now to try to regulate climate change or try to regulate greenhouse gas emissions at the global level. So let me start with the UNFCCC going all the way back to 1992. So some of you may remember or have heard about the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, which was a big effort by the United Nations to try to get countries to come together and address some of the kind of most pressing environmental problems. One of the things that came out from that was this 1992 Framework Convention. And what was kind of interesting about this is that the UN or the countries that were pushing for this at the UN decided, let's, instead of trying to get everyone to agree right now on a bunch of ambitious targets with regard to regulating greenhouse gas emissions, let's try to get a foot in the door first. Let's try to get the countries of the world on record acknowledging that climate change is a problem. Okay, but we won't ask them to do anything very concrete just now. We'll just try to get them on record saying climate change is a problem and we need to keep an eye on this. And in that sense, the 1992 Framework Convention was very successful. It was a treaty that was ratified by every country in the world, right? But it was easy for them to ratify because it didn't ask them to do anything other than just acknowledge that they're dealing with a problem. Okay. It also established some important principles that would come to kind of guide the climate change discourse over the years that come. So, for example, it established this principle of what's called common but differentiated responsibilities, which is the kind of diplomatic speak for saying that, yes, we know that everyone right now is contributing to climate change in some way, because we all drive cars, we all do things that are producing greenhouse gas emissions in some way, but we also realize that different people or different societies have different abilities to address these. So in general, the richer countries have greater resources to, for example, build, like solar farms, for example, than some of the poorer countries do. Okay. So what the UNFCCC did, as I said earlier, was just to kind of establish the basic principle that climate change is a problem. And it asked the member states to commit to monitoring their greenhouse gas emissions. They didn't have to necessarily make any sharp reductions. They just had to report on what their emissions were and to keep monitoring over the years that come. And it also established this thing called the COP, the Conference of Parties, which was basically going to be like a big climate change conference that would meet once a year to continue making progress on the problem. So, for example, last November, COP26, it was the 26th iteration of the Conference of Parties, met in Glasgow, Scotland, which happens to be my home city, where there was like a big conference, lots of heads of state attended, and they tried to kind of make further progress towards international negotiations on how we deal with climate change. But as I said before, the UNFCCC is just a framework convention. It didn't call on states to make any specific reductions. It just said, let's just agree this is a problem and let's agree to keep an eye on it. And as I said, everyone agreed to that because it's a fairly easy ask to make of people. Okay, then 5 years later, at the third COP, the Conference of the Parties in Kyoto, we got a big agreement called the Kyoto Protocol, okay? And what this did was, this was the first attempt to try to actually come up with something a bit more binding in terms of regulating countries' greenhouse gas emissions. And so what the Kyoto Protocol did was it came up with this big kind of schedule at the end of the treaty, saying like for each country, what their target was over a 5-year period in terms of their greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So it would say like, Canada has to reduce by a certain amount. France has to reduce by a certain amount. And it specified exactly what that amount was for each country. And all of these countries were party to this negotiation over what that amount would be and so on and so forth. What's really interesting about the Kyoto Protocol was that it only put these binding emissions targets on the developed, the richer countries, because of this issue I talked about before of like fairness in terms of, you know, acknowledging the fact that it's been the richer countries that over the past 200 years since the Industrial Revolution have really contributed most of the carbon dioxide that's lingering in our atmosphere. They're the ones that should really sort of bear the brunt of paying the bill of fixing this problem. So the way the Kyoto Protocol tried to kind of deal with that was to say, well, okay, let's create a system of rules that only applies to the rich countries. And for the developing countries, we'll let them off the hook because they're rapidly growing, or what we hope will become rapidly growing economies. But as of right now, they're still relatively poor countries by global standards. And so we shouldn't kind of burden them with the problem of trying to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So the Kyoto Protocol operated from 2008 to 2012 with, you know, very kind of mixed success. Some countries managed to achieve their targets. Other countries didn't. The US didn't end up ratifying the Kyoto Protocol. Even Canada, you know, a country that we think of as being much more kind of environmentally conscious, ended up having to withdraw from the Kyoto Protocol because it realized it wasn't going to even come close to meeting its targets, especially after the discovery of the oil fields in like the north of Canada. And so the Kyoto Protocol was, or you know, has come to be thought of as a failure, essentially, in the sense that it, you know, it made some progress. It created some kind of legal framework to try to get countries to set targets, but this model wasn't overall considered very successful. And some of the most significant problems are like the fact that the US didn't ratify, right? So although the US signed the agreement, that was then when the George W. Bush administration came to power, they made clear that, you know, they weren't going to try to get this through the Senate. And in any case, it would have been extremely difficult to get the 2/3 supermajority in the Senate needed to ratify this. So without the largest economy on the world on board, it was going to be really hard to try to get this regime to kind of be the method we use to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. Many other critics point to the fact, the US, of course, that there was a kind of unfairness now in the sense that all the obligations were on the rich countries, but none were on the developing countries. And at that point in 1997, like China and India were both treated as developing countries, but these are now, or especially China is now the world's largest emitter. So many of the rich countries resented the fact that China was getting a free pass here, even though China's level of development was a lot lower back in 1997 than it was now. Other critics pointed to the fact that the so-called Annex I countries, the richer countries, were given goals that basically just weren't ambitious enough. And so even if they did, and you know, many countries did succeed in meeting these goals, it wasn't going to be enough to really kind of move the needle in terms of the problem of global warming. Other people drew attention to the fact that, you know, this relatively short commitment period of giving every country these 5-year goals just created incentives to pursue short-term goals. So for example, if you're a country that depends heavily on coal for electricity generation, one kind of like quick fix you can make to reduce your overall carbon footprint is to switch from coal-powered to natural gas-powered power plants. Now, both are producing carbon dioxide, but natural gas-powered plants are better than coal-powered plants in relative terms, because for each like kilojoule of energy that you produce, you're producing less carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So there was a lot of just kind of kicking the can down the road rather than doing the kind of like more aggressive decarbonization that was needed. Okay, so as I said, the Kyoto Protocol was considered not very successful. And then the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change through the COP agreements were kind of trying to come up with a new model. And in 2015, at the COP21 meeting in Paris, they came up with a landmark climate agreement called the Paris Agreement. And this is what we've got in place now, right? And the Paris Agreement is really interesting from like a political scientist's point of view, because it adopted a whole different model of trying to think about how we're going to kind of regulate our way out of this problem. And so what it did was, rather than saying to countries, you've got to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions by some prescribed amount, it instead said to the countries of the world, you guys choose your own targets. We're going to treat this like a kind of honor system. Okay, we want all countries, regardless of whether you're a rich country or a poor country, to just kind of do some kind of soul searching and decide what is the target you can come up with and feel comfortable committing to, and pledge to do that. So when I teach this to my students, and I try to kind of think of like analogies to help them sort of get their head around what's going on here, I said, think of it as if like a group of friends are out at a restaurant and you're giving a tip, right? The restaurant isn't forcing you, or at least most restaurants aren't forcing you to tip at a certain level. We're just asking each of you, what do you think is a fair amount to give, as your tip? And so this is kind of like what the Paris Agreement is doing. It's saying to the countries, do the best you can. We know that it's not really enforceable. We know that there are going to be inequalities in this, but do your best. Because when we tried a more kind of top-down system of like forcing countries to do different things, that didn't work very well either. Okay, so this is basically where we've ended up with. And so the Paris Agreement has now been really widely accepted. Like almost every country in the world has accepted it. That some of you, or many of you, will remember in 2017, President Trump withdrew the US from the Paris Agreement, which caused like a big crisis in terms of, worries about the viability of this agreement. But President Biden has now brought the US back into the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement, as I said, is, we can really just think of it as an honor system. It depends on voluntary compliance. But since then, and like even most recently at COP26 in Glasgow this past year, there's been further efforts to try to kind of solidify the regulations, or to clarify what some of the regulations are under the Paris Agreement. So right now, this is our best hope. So we've gone, as I said, from a top-down approach to a more kind of bottom-up approach of letting countries set their own targets. And we're keeping our fingers crossed that this is going to work better than the Kyoto Protocol. What I'll do, because I want to make sure we allow enough time for discussion, I want to just end with this graph produced by the United Nations Environmental Programme, that they produce this thing every year called the Emissions Gap Report. And what that tries to do is basically show us what the kind of gap is between where we need to be and where we currently are. And obviously the hope would be that over successive years, we'd start to close that gap. But right now, and let me just explain what this is showing here. So here, the x-axis is time, starting at 2015. The y-axis is the cumulative amount of carbon dioxide and other equivalent gases in the atmosphere that are just gathering there. Now, in order for us to meet the target of being like between 1.5 and 2 degrees, oh, sorry, that's not the cumulative amount. Sorry, that's the amount that's being produced every year, right? In order for us to meet these targets, we need to dramatically reduce the amount that's currently being produced. And so this line here, this purple line where I'm moving the mouse over just now, that showed us the trajectory we were on back in 2010, 12 years ago, where it looked like we were doing really badly. We were going to end up with an amount of accumulation of carbon dioxide that would lead to absolutely catastrophic levels of global warming. Thankfully, even just what we've done since, so between 2010 and now 2022, we've managed to bend the curve, so we're about here. right? So if we keep going with the policies that have currently been agreed on by the countries of the world, we're going to end up most likely with around about a 2.8 degree level of warming, which is obviously way better than some of the like 4-degree nightmare scenarios that people were worried about and continue to be worried about, but especially a few years ago. But that's still way off target in terms of avoiding some of the really bad stuff that starts to happen once we get to a level of warming above 1.5 degrees. So pretty much everyone agrees now that we need to be in this 1.5 degree range. And as you'll see, we still have a big gap. We still have all this to make up. So we need to take the progress we've already made and really double down and make like much, much more progress in order to hopefully, you know, in the next few years, see a trajectory that is kind of going to land us in this 1.5 to 2 degree range, so that climate change will still be a problem. It's not going to go away. It will still be a problem, but at least it will be like a manageable problem as opposed to a catastrophic problem. So I think I will stop there so that we still have time for discussion, and we'll open it up to questions either in the chat, or feel free to raise your hand on Zoom if you want to ask something.
Professor Greenhill, before we open it up to everyone in the room, we did get a couple of questions in advance. So I think I'll read one of them out loud to you right now. What role do you see NGOs playing in regards to ESG disclosure?
Yeah, okay, so NGO stands for non-governmental organizations. So these are any of the kind of like activist groups that care about climate change, you know, so basically all environmental organizations. And they can play an important role in terms of just moving the public conversation along. So getting people to start to take more notice of what's going on with regard to climate change, getting people to ask their elected representatives to start prioritizing this issue more. Now, the question specifically asked about what's called ESG disclosures, which stands for environmental and social governance. So what that means is that most modern corporations nowadays are under pressure to try to show not only that they're making a profit, but also that they're operating as kind of like responsible corporations as part of a larger in the society in which they're operating. So there is pressure from investors to kind of ask the companies that they're investing in to make sure that they're behaving responsibly with regard to issues like climate change. So for example, many colleges and universities have come under pressure to divest their endowments from companies that invest heavily in like the fossil fuel industry and so on. So there's the hope that that kind of pressure might help to make investing in fossil fuels less attractive. So I think that's definitely part of the solution. My talk has focused mainly on intergovernmental solutions, like through international agreements, but I don't want to sound like I'm dismissing the other kinds of forces that are taking place at the societal level through the action of environmental NGOs, and possibly also the action of more kind of socially and environmentally conscious corporations that, you know, are trying to kind of be more cognizant of the effect of their operations on climate change.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I also want to say that was a wonderful presentation. I really appreciate it. Professor Greenhill, if you don't mind stopping sharing your screen, I just realized if anyone's watching this after the fact, they're just seeing the one slide as we have a discussion. So I just want to make sure they're able to see you give the talk for the open discussion. Thank you. And I do see we had a couple of questions come into the chat. So I don't know if you see them on your screen, but I'll go ahead and read this aloud. Conflict due to climate change is likely. However, do you see any positive signs for growing international peace initiatives due to deals on climate issues?
No, that's a really good question. I'd love to be able to say yes. I'm right now, at least, you know, maybe if I think about it more deeply, I'll come up with better examples. But I mean, I suppose there is the hope that there, that this shared crisis could have an effect on kind of uniting people, and I'd like to be optimistic about that. I'd like to think that, the whole of humanity facing the same threat is going to kind of cause people to put aside their differences, maybe in the same way that, like, after the horrors of like World War II and the Holocaust, the countries of the world got together and decided, we need to create this body called the United Nations, and we're going to try to outlaw the use of war and so on. Unfortunately, it's hard to be too optimistic about that. We saw also, like, even as you'll recall, a couple of years ago, like in the first couple of weeks of the COVID pandemic, it really seemed like everyone was kind of gelling together much more because of this common threat. But then, unfortunately, in the weeks that followed, that started to come undone and people kind of went back to their respective corners. So I think in theory, it's possible, but to be honest with you, I'm not too optimistic just now. But I'd like to hope that maybe, especially if things get worse, that there'll be more of a kind of move in that direction. Should I just go through the questions in order? So I see Joel Harmon has asked, so from a political perspective, where is the zone of feasibility to make the magnitude of change needed? What do we need to do, and what will we be able to do? So yeah, so I think, so this is a really interesting question too, because just from a kind of communications point of view, I think for people like myself and, all of us who care about climate change, it's really important that we are kind of realistic about how we message this, right? If we do, or if we take the position that we're all doomed, that it's too late, we've missed all these targets, it's all a disaster, there's no hope for humanity, then that's really harmful, because that will kind of make people just throw their hands up in the air and say there's no point even trying. The reality is, and that's that last slideshow, we have already made an incredible amount of progress, right? And political leaders now are talking about climate in a way that they most certainly weren't, even just 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. So there is a lot of room for change. And it's not as if, it's not as if the planet is going to be destroyed. Some of that rhetoric about, unmitigated climate change is just going to cause the extinction of humans. It won't. It'll lead to terrible suffering for huge portions of the human population, but the planet will still survive, right? So I think what's more important is we kind of present this to our fellow citizens as a choice. Like, do you want this really bad thing to happen? Or do you want this mildly uncomfortable thing to happen? Because I think if it's presented that way, people are more likely to say, we'll choose the mildly uncomfortable thing and let's do all we can do to get there first. And so I feel that there is a lot that we can do. So for example, one of the real kind of optimistic stories of the climate transition is, for example, the cost of renewable electricity. So solar panels have come down in price exponentially over the past few decades because of greater investment in that. Hopefully the more we can do to kind of send a signal, through government regulation, but also market signals, that this is the way that things are going, the easier it will be for countries and industries to invest in alternative fuel technologies. And what is actually really optimistic is we've now been able to see this, what's called a kind of decoupling of greenhouse gas emissions and economic growth. So it used to be that, if you wanted to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, you had to just deal with lower levels of economic growth and accept that maybe you'll be putting a big kind of dampener on your country's ability to thrive economically. Now that's no longer the case. Now it's pretty clear that if you want your country to grow economically, you need to kind of embrace these alternative technologies. So I think there is a lot of room for optimism. And I would say, in terms of what do we need to do? I would say the most useful thing we can do is to kind of keep the pressure up on our elected leaders to take climate change seriously. I mean, of course, there are things we can do as individuals in terms of, you know, switching to electric vehicles and so on. But obviously, as individuals, the impact that that's going to have is pretty modest. But the more we can do to kind of, you know, make sure that the people occupying positions of power are making the right decisions, that the better we'll be. See the next question from Benjamin Palak. How are these goals impacted by the industrialization of developing nations and nations who did not co-sign on to the Paris Agreement and prior conferences? Okay, so the first thing is, as more and more developing countries, and here, if I may, can I just go back to sharing a slide again for a moment?
Yep, absolutely. You should be able to.
And then, sorry, let me just get this back. Are you seeing my slides now?
We are.
Okay. So, for example, so here's a graph showing the annual amount of carbon dioxide emissions by different countries. So you see, like, the United States has brought it under control. Europe has brought it under control. It's still very high, obviously. China is like going through the roof. India is increasing really rapidly too. So obviously these are like, they're really concerning, you know, because if they continue in that trajectory, we're not really getting very far. But, you know, so the more we can do to help countries like China and India decarbonize their economies and do so rapidly, the better it will be. So, you know, there are already many initiatives in place to try to assist with like technology transfer. I mean, China, as it happens, although it's still producing an awful lot of greenhouse gases, it is investing very heavily in like renewable energy technologies. Other countries, like many countries in, you know, Africa and other parts of Asia and Latin America, although their total emissions are very small in relative terms, there's a lot more that we in like country, you know, citizens of kind of richer countries can be doing through our governments to help like finance the kind of decarbonization of these societies.